Thank you for joining us in this exciting session where we will focus on worldwide issues related to women and underrepresented minorities in science. I'm thrilled today that we have the participation of Dr. Anthony Hyman from the Max Planck Institute. His lab is focused on research in molecular cell biology. He obviously has won many international awards and also is a member of the Wellcome Trust Strategic Advisory Board in Science. And from 2010 to 2013 was also a managing director of the Max Planck Institute. He has a very unique story to share, really important perspectives. So Dr. Hyman, you are beginning.
Thank you very much, Karla. It's actually a pleasure to talk. I've got a completely different perspective on many of the things that lots of Thank Society is interested in due to the loss of my wife, Suzanne Eaton, due to a senseless act of violence that many of you know about. And Suzanne was an outstanding scientist. She was the best of American education. She went to Brown. She was fluent in many languages. She's a gifted pianist. She's a Taekwondo black belt. She's open to many things. And we met together in San Francisco as postdocs. And then we moved to Germany to start our careers. And the good thing that happened there was, Suzanne was always really wanted to have children as well as have a career. That was very important to her right from the beginning. She was a very committed scientist as well. And Germany and EMBL really provided the place that she could do that, with its outstanding childcare. From 3 months, you could leave your child, so-called Stillgruppe, as they called it in German there, the breastfeeding group, right on site, and then they would give a call every time the child wanted to breastfeed, and Suzanne could go over and breastfeed and come back again. And so that was what was really essential for making that work, in my opinion. I always stress that without good childcare, it's almost impossible to do that job. And of course, we had the salaries necessary to afford all the help we needed. And so I think a crucial thing for supporting young women scientists we've seen is like the Nusson Volhard Foundation provides money to help young scientists, young female scientists with cleaning help in the house or daycare and other sorts of things. So I think those are also essential ways to support it. And I think also what was a key point to success was she was in a research institute. And so she wasn't pulled in a million different directions at the beginning. So many young women faculty get pulled in so many different directions at the beginning. They're having their kids, they're asked to be on millions of committees because it's thought that it's important to have female representation on committees. But by being in an institute with sort of no teaching and no grants, she could really focus in on it. So, I always think a crucial point is to make sure that, young female faculty are not pulled in all these different directions. And, that allowed her to build a career as a successful scientist. And we had wonderful times together. And, I've had a lot of success recently in science and won a few prizes. And I always say that, when you meet someone young and you grow together, these successes are shared successes. And when she's not there, actually, the success doesn't mean nearly as much as it would have done if you've been together with them. So, so these are the sort of team effort you build together. And if I look at Suzanne's career and I think about, women in science, I think one problem that always comes up is she had to fight for recognition, and by being married to a famous male scientist, that is a huge problem in the sense that no one ever approached her and asked her for a senior job. I had a great job, and people were always asking me if I wanted to move, and I'd say, well, I have a great job, but you should ask Suzanne, because I always committed in my mind that because she followed me to East Germany in a way when we set up this Max Planck Institute, right? In other words, she wanted to go back to California, but we went further and further east, and ended up in Dresden after the wall came down. But because of that, when I became a director, it was a great job. I was always certain in my mind, if someone approached her with a really good job, I would really look carefully into it. But no one ever did really. And because there's too much that goes on, oh, she's married to Tony Hyman, she'll never move. So that's all hiring committees need to not ever have that conversation, basically, until they should talk to someone directly. I think that's a crucial thing. It's these sort of And often you see female scientists being torpedoed in committees for that sort of hearsay. So that's one thing I think that came up. You know, and I think also what I learned, I think, from losing Suzanne, how many women open up to me about harassment and violence. You know, it's actually very shocking as a man to really realize what's going on. You know, normally I don't think we realize. We're not told actually what it's really like, but because of what I've been through, I have been told a lot of shocking stories that made me realize, you know, how much more work we have to do to prevent harassment, you know, to make women feel safe, you know, and, you know, she had lots of Me Too experiences, you know, that were turned out to be not, you know, an isolated incident. So that has been something that's really been difficult for me to accept, I think, in that sense. I mean, Suzanne was a Taekwondo black belt, second Dan, who had a speciality in fighting off men who attacked her. That was what she used to do in demonstrations. It just wasn't enough in the end. You know, so she did as much as she could to prepare, but it, you know, wasn't enough. And so that's something which I feel strongly about after this is, you know, what steps can we take to really make sure that that is brought to the forefront, where women who told me things but never felt they can tell anyone in authority about that, right? There's still something that's blocking women from going and reporting these things, which are dreadful, you know, dreadful things you hear about, you know, where people should be in jail for them, right? But there's still a culture of not saying it. So that's one of the things I think I feel strongly about. The other thing I feel, and Suzanne and I used to talk about this a lot, and this is something she also felt, which, you know, I'm always, of course, as a man, you have to be extremely careful about saying too much about those things. But now I feel more emboldened in the sense of, basically, I worry that too much discussion with young female faculty or young female scientists about problems with women in science is counterproductive. You know, as senior people, we have to take policy steps to ensure that there's good representation of women in science, of course, you know, that it should be 50-50. But every time you tell a young scientist that, I worry it just creeps into the mind that it's difficult. And the reason I always give for that is that my father used to suffer from terrible depression. He would sit in a dark room, and as a young boy, I, of course, very worried about my father, and I go and say, "Dad, don't be depressed." And he'd say, "If you say don't be depressed, the only word I hear is depressed. You know, say let's go and play football or something." And I worry that all this over discussion with young faculty, female faculty, on their own without any men in the room, is sort of counterproductive in that way, and that, you know, we should just confine some of that to policy steps. So that's one thing I also felt from watching Suzanne's career, is that all the discussion happened all the time about how difficult it was, fed back in her about, oh yes, it is quite difficult in a way. And so I just wonder whether that's something we could also think about. So, you know, so overall, I would say that if I look at her career, it's a classic career where she was successful, but she reached a glass ceiling, still based on things that are going on, that, you know, over politeness about not offending her male husband in terms of offering her jobs, having her time diced up by being on millions of committees because there have to be female representation on committees, you know, all these things in a way fed back as a sort of made it more difficult to her to move on. And I think that's one problem that's, well, I think we were talking about that before, to me is a difficult question, because, you know, it's very important to have women on hiring committees. As Suzanne always said, often I'd say, oh, that woman's great on the committee. Oh yeah, and then go, I didn't think about that. You know, so in other words, for some reason, she used to say, men remember men better than they remember women. Just she'd seen on committee after committee. And so you need female representation. And that's not, you know, it's not deliberate bias, but it's a definite unconscious bias. But the more you put on committees, the less time they have to do science, is what they're actually, what we're actually rewarded for. So that's my sort of overall feeling on that viewpoint of it. So yeah, I think that's sort of really what I wanted to say today about it. You know, just that, you know, just maybe in front to say, just to thank Suzanne, as I, you know, for all that she gave me, and without her support and love, and also I think sheer intellectual brilliance, you know, I never would have done what I was able to do as a scientist. And she probably would have said the same thing as well. So, you know, that sort of team effort, I think, was a great thing in life for both of us.
So thank you so much. That was such a helpful description from on the ground of the challenges for a couple working in science, a male perspective in working for science, and obviously with the extreme tragedy, an extreme example of what happened with Suzanne, with every advantage and a bright career ahead of her. And even with all of that, look at this tragic outcome. Just remind people that bios for our speakers are on the conference website, and also a little background about Suzanne Eaton as well. And there's information also, I think, on the Max Planck website.
Yes, we have a lot of tributes to Suzanne on the website.
Yeah,
she was loved and respected.
They're wonderful tributes, and I remember reading them over the weeks and months following her murder, which is really tragic and extreme. So this is one example of the worldwide perspective of challenges for women in science. This is not just an American issue, it's a worldwide issue. A wonderful speaker now will be Dame Jocelyn Bell Burnell, who I also have been reading about a lot since her Breakthrough Prize in 2018. It's so interesting to me that her career, the highs and the lows, have some parallels with Rosalind Franklin, both British, but more importantly, both overlooked for early work that they had done. For Dame Jocelyn, I think she was in her mid-20s, still a graduate student, and her discoveries of pulsar were awarded with Nobel Prizes for her 2 male advisors. And it was only in 2018 that she leapfrogged right over them to receive the $3 million, I think it's almost $3 million Breakthrough Award. And she has gone about her career with incredible success, and clearly now toward the end of her career for something that happened very early on at the beginning of her career. So I'd love to hear a little bit from her about how that all came about, her surprise or lack of surprise of finally getting that award. Is a great story for all of us to hear. So Dame Jocelyn, thank you so much for joining us, and we all look forward to this incredible story.
Thank you, Karla, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm speaking to you from England, Britain, but the title of this session is Worldwide Issues, and I have some interesting worldwide data, or access to some worldwide data. I've spent almost all my life in academia or research labs, and in astronomy and physics. There's an international body for astronomers called the International Astronomical Union, and it keeps track of its membership by country and by gender. And it's very interesting. Broadly speaking, the Southern European countries, the Southern and Central American countries do best for the percentage of astronomers who are female. Northern European countries and the English-speaking countries do worst. Well, except for Japan, which perhaps not surprisingly is way, way down the league. So clearly the culture in a country matters. Interestingly, 3 years ago, the Netherlands was below average. And now, 3 years later, it's pulled itself up by 3% and is on average. And I inquired of Netherlands colleagues in astronomy how they managed to do this in just 3 years, and was told that they had been allowed to have positions that were open only to women for a limited term. And this was felt to have made a significant difference to the numbers. You might be interested to know that the USA has 17 of its membership female. Germany has 13. The UK has 13. The world average is 19%. The USA actually makes up a quarter of the membership, so it's pretty clever of it to be below the average if it's contributing a quarter of the membership. Perhaps there is an issue there. There are 14,000 members of that union, so the statistics are pretty good. And another interesting snippet, out of the 14,000, only 4 people declined to say whether they were male or female, those being the only options offered. I want to go back to something that I was involved in Britain, which has produced a huge change in the position of women in science in academia. I was one of a small group of female scientists struggling to find ways of improving the situation for women in science in academia. And we floundered around until one of us, who is a bit of a psychologist, said, you know, vice chancellors, that means presidents of universities, are competitive guys. And they were all guys at that stage. If we create a prize for the most woman-friendly university, they'll compete. Now, we were poor. We could only afford a glass rose bowl. But we announced this competition and they competed and we awarded the glass rose bowl. And we did that several years in a row. And then there was an interesting change. The chief medical officer for the UK at that time was one Dame Sally Davis. And one day she was meeting with the heads of medical schools from universities all around the country. And they had the usual sort of discussion that heads of departments have with funding bodies. And at the end of the meeting, she said, you're all men. Where are the women? And they said, doesn't matter. And she had, as she put it, a rush of blood to the head. And she said, unless your department holds an Athena Swan Bronze Award by a certain date, about 18 months away, you will not be eligible to apply for my funding. And when a funder applies those sort of constraints, people take notice. Athena Swan was the name of this award we had created, and suddenly interest in it snowballed. It's subsequently been extended from science to arts and humanities, and it's become a gender issue rather than a woman issue, because in arts and humanities, it's often men that are in short supply. It's been extended to Ireland, to Canada, to Australia, and it's coming in the USA in an even more elaborate guise. It's called Sea Change. Some of you may have got to hear about it. It includes not just gender, but other dimensions as well. So I'm proud of what we've done. It did get in Britain a bit heavily bureaucratic, but boy, has it accelerated change. And the two key factors were having such an award scheme and having the funders require it of applicants. So a little bit more personal stuff about my situation. I'm probably one of the oldest speakers. I was born during the last World War, at a time in Britain when girls were expected to marry, to stay at home, be wives and mothers. So they didn't need an academic education. Many of them trained as secretaries or unqualified nurses or filing clerks, things like that. When I came to start my secondary education, I had to fight to get into the science class. Girls did domestic science. We had to learn how to cook and sew because we were going to be wives and mothers. I did fight to get into the science class. I did very well in it, particularly in physics, and focused on physics as I went through high school. In university, I ended up the only female in the honours physics class, 49 men and me. and I faced quite a lot of what we would now call harassment. It was, quote, the tradition that when a woman entered the lecture hall, all the guys whistled, stamped, banged their desks, generally made as much noise, created as much embarrassment as possible. And the women students would wait outside the lecture hall and enter as a group because that felt better. But as the only female in that honours class, I had no group to enter with. And it also meant I didn't really have anybody to work with. There were the guys and me. And another sexist experience, following the discovery of pulsars, there were a lot of interviews, television, journalists, and so on. The newspaper journalists were the worst from my point of view. They wanted to know what my bust, waist, and hip measurements were, how many boyfriends I had at a time. And the photographers would ask if I could undo some of my buttons, please. As a PhD student, you don't have a lot of power. I was still a PhD student. My male colleagues did nothing to intervene or defend me. I would have loved to have been very, very rude to those journalists and photographers, but I didn't dare be. I was just somewhat uncooperative. After the discovery, after my PhD, I got married a man who had to move around the country to get promotion. And so I followed my husband moving around the country. And then there was a child. At that time, the country did not approve of women working. They were sure that if women worked, the children would be delinquent. I have great fun these days when I lecture to a group of students or school kids. I say to them, how many of your mothers work? And up go most hands in the room. How many of you are delinquent? There's always one on the back row who puts their hand up. But absolute rubbish, but this was widely believed. So mothers were strongly discouraged from working, and there weren't childminding facilities, because if there were childminding facilities, mothers would work and the kids would be delinquent. So I ended up working part-time, basically while the child was in school or nursery. I had a number of miscellaneous posts because I was following my husband around the country, and it felt a bit like a game of snakes and ladders. You have such a game in the USA? Board game? You know, we'd land up somewhere, I'd climb up a ladder in the nearest astronomy place. Husband would say, it's time we moved. I slide down a snake. I go find another ladder, climb up it. Husband moves, slide down the snake, and so on. But I did get wide experience of astronomy, astrophysics, and I had a lot of fun. I've also had a lot of recognition. The organisers of this session possibly aren't aware of this, and that might be because the majority of my awards are in Europe, and the Atlantic is very wide, isn't it, folks? But in the USA, I've had 6 honorary doctorates, 5 major prizes, and I belong to 3 academies. And that's only about a fifth or a quarter of all my awards. So I feel I've done very well. I don't feel aggrieved, at least not too much. And I would really like to say, please, please, could we stop worrying about awards and how much money people get, and put effort into pulling up women, younger women, who've had a tough time and need support and encouragement to get qualifications. Thank you.
Thank you. That's also great from my side to hear that. One thing I want to add about that is that I agree with you, Jocelyn, if I may say so, in the sense that, you know, often institutions go out and they want to recruit more female faculty. They put that as their goal. But my viewpoint is that that shouldn't be what you're judged on. You should be judged by how many faculty you create from your institution. It should be a push rather than a pull system. Of course, both are important. But, you know, what I'd like to see is that all institutions have to say, and maybe that does work in UK with the Athena Swan system, that you have to say that. But, you know, if all institutions prepped their young female scientists to go and get jobs, there'd be no problem. As it is, of course, the richer institutes that have more money can go and get and hire, get more female faculty potentially. And that's the pull. So that's something else I completely agree. It's that all institutions need to be fully focused on taking their young female trainees and making them successful.
One of the spin-offs, which has some unfortunate consequences, is departments have to declare how many female candidates and how many male candidates they invite to interviews. And a number of our young Oxford female postdocs are complaining they're getting invited to interviews.
Exactly, yeah.
The place has no intention of recruiting them. They're simply make up the numbers of females.
Exactly.
A bit of that's great because it gives you interview experience. Too much of it takes up too much time.
Well, I think you both have focused on this incredible process of the pipeline. Each step is important, the interview process is, but also, as you both have alluded to, the notion of promotion and tenure track access by women is critical also, and moving up into positions of power and influence is critical. But Dame Jocelyn, your story is quite moving and quite inspiring. And I thank you so much for sharing it with us and for continuing to share your experience, your thoughts, and really motivating all of these women in science who are following in your footsteps. So thank you so much, both of you, for a really fabulous session. And I know the hundreds of people around the world who are listening to this will feel the same. And we all thank you.